Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming in person, but also I would like to thank our public on YouTube. And today we are going to have a talk by Professor Dusan Boric and from the University of La Sapienza in Rome, and also from the New York University. This is a talk organized by the Institute of Biosciences and the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology here at the University of São Paulo. And we are thrilled to have Dusan to tell us about the bioarchaeology of the forager-farmer transition in Southeast Europe. So we are also happy to take questions either here from the audience, but also anyone on YouTube, feel free to post your questions. And we are also taking questions in Portuguese or Spanish. We can translate these as well. So without much further ado, Dusan, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank both Mercedes and Eduardo for actually organizing this. And it was like great pleasure for me to come here and giving this talk to you. I know that it's a different topic to what most of the people here probably work on, but I think there might be, or I hope there might be some interesting connections. And in fact, our connection between sort of both Mercedes and Eduardo is that like we met well, separately, but like with them, but we met at the University of Cambridge, which is one of those hubs where a lot of connections are forged between the researchers. And this was a long time ago. We're not going to mention any absolute chronology, but like it was sort of a great pleasure back in the day and now as well to kind of like interact with them, and I hope that continues. So what I'm going to talk about is principally various aspects of my recent research, and research that kind of goes back to some time. My principal sort of research is actually based in various areas of Southeastern Europe. Southeastern Europe is like this kind of like part of, let's say, in a neglected part of Europe. Like if you have Western Europe with all the kind of cool stuff happening and a lot of research taking place, definitely Southeastern Europe is the area that kind of lags behind in many of the kind of historically lags behind in much of the research that was done there. Yet I think we're catching up, and at the same time, I think that this is a very important area of Europe, as you could imagine, especially for the question of the arrival of farming, arrival of agriculture. That there's the geographical sort of spacious proximity of Southeastern Europe to those centers of initial agricultural developments that we find in the Near East, in Southwestern Asia. And so kind of like what's happening in Southeastern Europe sets a tone for everything that then kind of happens and kind of reverberates like across Europe, across different sort of zones of the European continent as the Neolithic spreads from Southeastern Europe in the kind of like northwestern direction, and the rest is kind of like history in the sense of like what that Neolithic kind of then sort of leads to later on. So the spread of the Neolithic is sort of, there's this kind of like a map that sort of marks sort of what I just mentioned. It's sort of like different sort of arrows of movement and the spread from the Near East, from the kind of like Fertile Crescent, or kind of the initial zone of the Neolithic development, into the east as well as into the west. And Southeastern Europe obviously is this kind of area here that we're talking about, encompassing Greece and different countries of the Balkans. So very early in the development of the research in this region, it was like believed that it was migration or diffusion that was like the kind of main sort of movement of change. And then 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people were thinking and reconsidering things again, saying, well, it might have been just sort of diffusion of certain traits rather than proper migration of people that was like involved, and so on. And then we came full circle again, thanks to kind of ancient DNA analysis that sort of seem to indicate, not only for this period, but for many other periods, seem to indicate that it was actually kind of the movement of people, not just kind of ideas, concepts, goods, material culture, and so on, that really sort of brought colossal changes to the kind of landscape of the European continent, but elsewhere as well. And so ancient DNA was the kind of that catalyst that kind of changed the discourse of like our understanding of the Neolithization process. So it is the kind of with ancient genomes, and especially after, there was like the Neanderthal genome was sequenced in 2010, and then or 2009. Now I'm kind of like around that time, but then sort of basically after that, there was this particular discovery that like the best part of like, so the best preservation of the endogenous sort of DNA is in the cochlea of the petrous part of the temporal bone, that thing that is shown there. And, that discovery led to kind of this mini revolution in the sense of ancient DNA research. And it is actually kind of somewhere from around 2014. You see here 2010, 11, 12, 13, how many kind of like ancient genomes were sort of actually, we got the kind of the full genome, the whole genome. Then from 2014, with this discovery that we have very good preservation in the petrous part of the temporal bone, that we have this very good preservation on ancient DNA of the host, right? Like not the microorganisms that are there. We have kind of this incredible like number of kind of individuals analyzed, and sort of also being able to compare different individuals and kind of create these kind of incredibly complex stories of the migration movement, intermixing, and so on. So I'm going to say something about that, and this is only until 2018. So you could imagine like there's much more done more recently. Even back in the day, some of the studies had like 5, 6, 10 whole genomes. Now we're going in the excess of 700, 800 individuals per published sort of paper of the study that from different parts of the world. But like, of course, because of the research being concentrated so much in Europe, and of the preservation and everything and the historical sort of circumstances, a lot of that research, a lot of individuals are coming from Europe, and we are still kind of catching up for the rest of the world in terms of our knowledge of the ancient DNA. So our narrative, as I said, of the Neolithic change was greatly influenced by ancient DNA. Here's just sort of like some of these kind of, I really like this cover of the Nature from 2014, this kind of melting pot of different sort of kind of identification of different populations that is constantly changing as we kind of like go with like new sort of individuals with like additional data being modeled by archaeogeneticists. What we get is like kind of like even host populations that don't exist anymore, but like we could reconstruct them from ancient DNA, or kind of like better understand population dynamics that were taking part in the past. Here's another example of a more recent paper. I was involved in this study. This is like sort of kind of like looking at this southern arc between sort of southern Eastern Europe and the areas of Southwest Asia, where we have this kind of like interesting examples of the people called Yamnaya people, who are coming from the steppes of Russia, mixing with the indigenous sort of forager communities in Southeast Europe and elsewhere, and then also kind of like major population movements across different times in the Near East, within Anatolia and the rest of the Near East. But let me just kind of come back to the archaeological narrative about sort of migration and mobility. This is something that was like discarded in the past, like it was not so popular in, let's say, at the end of the 20th century, and became much more popular more recently, thanks to the ancient DNA. Yet in the past, we had like archaeologists who were kind of very explicitly sort of talking about migration and mobility as kind of important drivers of culture change, of kind of things kind of happening exactly because people are moving, interacting, and meeting. And this is like the paper from 1990, I think, by David Anthony, where he talks about migration archaeology. Don't, kind of discard the notion of migration kind of like don't discard the baby with the bathwater. So kind of like even though we might be critical of the notion of migration, we still need to consider it in other explanations and interpretations of different past events and different things that are happening in the past. And he kind of introduces in this paper very interesting sort of concepts like pull and push factors, like return migration. So kind of like not just seeing migration as kind of like, progressive directional thing, but kind of a much more complex way of people, populations, groups interacting among each other, and kind of like we need to kind of like account with all of that when we are sort of trying to provide nuanced narratives about the past. It also kind of something that really sort of echoes certain processes that we even see today, right? Like with the migration and mass migration being an issue. This is just from another day, some kind of like more right-wing sort of media in Europe. Europe is feeling the strain of mass migration, or kind of like, but really, I mean, there was like in 2015, that huge number of migrants were coming from the Near East into Europe, and funny enough, or not so funny, but like interestingly enough, they were kind of using the routes, the geographical affordances that are very similar to the ones that we see in the past. So all of these questions and issues surrounding migration, movement, mobility became really important for our present-day condition, and I think that's something that's quite interesting, how we come to think about these processes on the long term, and also kind of looking back into the past. So part of that kind of like one project that I sort of had like at Columbia University in New York a couple of years ago looked at this issue, the kind of like on the prehistoric movement and mobility that involved the spread of agriculture in Eurasia. That mobility obviously doesn't involve just people, but as you can imagine, it involves plants, and it also involves animals. And so kind of like multi-species, if you want, that's a popular terminology, kind of movement that doesn't involve just any animals, but also parasites, kind of like different microorganisms and so on, kind of very complex sort of set of multi-species sort of mobilities, I guess. So the project was multifaceted, like we worked on these different sort of aspects of data, kind of bioarchaeological in principle, but also kind of involving fieldwork, kind of providing a lot of ancient DNA samples for our archaeogeneticist colleagues, but also kind of like trying to find new ways to analyze migration mobility, not only on the level of populations, but also on the level of individual lives and what happens within, a person's like lifespan in the sense how we can sort of look at mobility in that sense. So I'll come back to that. So getting into the context of Southeastern Europe and to kind of provide you with some more detail, this is a map that shows like various important or kind of principal early Neolithic sites. There are many more, of course, than these black dots on the map, but it also shows here shaded areas where we actually have forager presences. So the presence of hunter-gatherers before the farming arrived to the region. As you can see, it's very sporadic. It's kind of like very scarce. It's kind of like you don't see very kind of like homogeneous kind of presence of foragers in the region. There are privileged sites across the area where you can actually see the presence of foragers. And then the farming communities, agricultural communities become much more visible in the archaeological record once they get there. So one particular area where I kind of focused my efforts, maybe I should have focused efforts on the blank areas, thinking about it, but like I focused the efforts in the area where we have a lot of evidence, and that's the area of the Danube Gorges. And another one is like along the Adriatic Sea, so kind of like the coastal area of the Adriatic Sea. So I'm going to say something about those regions. And here is again like, that kind of big map of the kind of like when the early Neolithic arrives to different parts of the region. Here is like a map that kind of maps this kind of movement. The earliest dates we have in Crete, at Knossos, and then we have like a bit later, but similar at the Frankti cave in southern Greece. Thessaly, classic region of the Neolithic in Greece, is around 6,400, 6,500 calibrated BCE. then it moves upwards and arrives to the area that I'm going to consider the Danube Gorges around 6,300, 6,200. So it's a relatively rapid sort of movement. We still kind of try to understand how that happens, in what waves it happens, like what are the dynamics involved, what is the dynamic of the interaction between first agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers. But there is some directionality to the movement, even with some obstacles perhaps in the way. I think we also, there are famous models such as demic diffusion and so on. And I'm actually gonna give you this table that kind of lists some of these possibilities and the archaeological expectations of what you would have. So kind of demic diffusion is the kind of demographic expansion, the way you have a rate of movement is gradual. And so you would think that this is like abrupt change, slow speed, around 1 kilometer a year. That's the archaeological expectation for the model that we have. Some other models to consider are folk migration. So you kind of have like a sort of movement of one people to another area very quickly. So again, the speed would be very, very quick. You have the infiltration of the full Neolithic package. When I say Neolithic package, that involves domesticates, plants and animals. It also involves certain types of material culture that are sort of very hallmarks of the Neolithic that are dramatically different from what you see in the forager context there. You would have maybe elite dominance, so you have like only a part of a community that sort of comes into a certain area, it starts dominating the locals. Historically we have these examples, obviously, but this would be maybe piecemeal adoption of certain traits of the Neolithic in the kind of visibility of the archaeological record. And infiltration, this is another possibility that we think also might have happened, is like sort of you have the kind of scout coming into different parts of the region where the majority of the region is still dominated, let's say, by hunter-gatherers, but you have like certain scouting groups of farmers kind of like going into certain parts of the region, choosing certain types of landscapes that are perhaps not so attractive to the local foragers, and maybe interacting or avoiding interaction with them. There's similar version of that is leapfrog colonization. So this is like it's not infiltration only to kind of close by territories, but it's kind of like you can infiltration like far into the land that is a new land for the incomers, where you would see maybe abrupt change and the full Neolithic package as well represented. And finally, the other example is this individual frontier mobility. In Europe, like in various other cases, we would have sometimes this kind of like frontier that is established between the hunter-gatherers and foragers. And this is historically as well. I mean, in Africa, you have examples of these kind of frontiers between sort of agriculturalists and the hunter-gatherer communities. And then you would have these kind of like interactions that are occasional interactions, or kind of like over time, they can lead to something, to more change. But both groups maintain their identity, whereas like only some individuals are being sort of infiltrated in one or the other group. So to test some of these models, I'm just going to go a little bit through the archaeological record of the area where I primarily worked. It's called the Danube Gorges. This is like the area where the Danube, River Danube, cuts through the Carpathian Mountains of sort of Romania and kind of in the Central Balkans. And sort of it creates like this kind of really pretty spectacular kind of area of several gorges and kind of river valleys. It's like 150 kilometers long. So we have many sites that are found due to the rescue projects done in that region in the 1970s because of the building of the hydroelectric dam. And so various sites in that region are basically excavated at that time in the 60s and the 70s. Some remain to be excavated also later. I was lucky to kind of get to one of these sites, and we were able to excavate there, kind of applying some modern methodology of excavation and recovery in order to kind of gain more information. But those people in the past who excavated for the first time did a major job as well there. And so this is the area that is sort of like, you can see it on this big map here, the area where we have 24 sites that can be dated to either late Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and the Neolithic. We also have earlier periods. I mean, there are Middle Paleolithic sites, but that's for another time. Like when we talk about that. So I hope like this video will work, because like I hope you can actually see what it looks like, just kind of like by looking kind of around in the area. But these are the gorges. Unfortunately, these are all the photos that are done after the level of the river went up some 15 meters or so. So it was dramatically different, obviously, at the time when before the 1960s, or actually before 1970, when the yes, that's like the museum that is like covering one of these key sites called Lepenski Vir, and I'm going to mention it now. So so the area is kind of like, this is how it actually looked like in the past, and this is like from the 19th century, kind of a rendering of the landscape. And what you see here, like cut into the rock, is actually a Roman road. Romans, when they were conquering Dacia, or kind of like the part of the kind of like province, later province, they cut this road with the Emperor Trojan, and they went through it. Only the crazy Romans would do this kind of thing, you know, kind of like just kind of like blasting through the rocks in order for the troops to kind of like pass through, building the bridges and kind of doing that, you know, like you've seen the Gladiator, right? Like the movie. So so essentially, but this is the kind of landscape that you're dealing with in the area, very famous for fishing actually in the region. This is like some of the kind of like even older sort of renderings of that landscape, with the rapids and cataracts and kind of like the Danube kind of flowing very, very, very fast there. You would have whirlpools, like with all of that, and all of these features were very important for the catch of fish, which is also ethnographically kind of like shown. Also, these fish that you see here are huge beluga that are coming from the Black Sea, and kind of like in this landscape they were kind of coming to spawn. And so kind of like you could imagine that people were having caviar or some version of caviar, fish roe, that was coming from this kind of anadromous sturgeon coming from the Black Sea, and kind of like being caught in this region. And the region was historically, ethnographically known for this kind of like very important grounds for fishing. So it's not a surprise that archaeologically then we have this kind of like incredible amount, like at least when it comes to the Mesolithic, or the kind of like early Holocene, and the beginning of the Neolithic record, where you have like a very specific culture developed in this region with this sort of landscape features. Like the site of Lepenski Vir was across this trapezoidal mountain. So it seems that sort of reflected in the shape of buildings, like these trapezoid-shaped floors with central hearts in the middle of these buildings. These kind of sandstone boulders that have this hybrid fish-human representations of them. Unique body adornment, which is actually kind of from the kind of like teeth, pharyngeal teeth of carp, Rutilus species, along with other things. Specialized fishing on whirlpools, in kind of like where people were catching these huge anadromous fish. Some estimates, like just to mention, of one of these specimens that was caught in the Mesolithic there, is that it probably was up to 5 meters long. So these were pretty, they were not all big as that, but some were very big. And then a plethora, kind of like a large number of primary and secondary inhumations and cremations that are found in the area that give us this kind of incredible material for various bioarchaeological analysis. So let me just move to the next. So the site of Lepenski Vir is kind of, you could consider it like one of these kind of special sites, or kind of like, you know, even though I wouldn't say special in the sense of like sacral, but it did have sacral elements, because there are also profane elements to the site. But there is this kind of a number of buildings that were excavated at the site. Almost the complete site was excavated from 1965 to 1971. And essentially, many burials were found associated with these trapezoid buildings in this one particular phase. The kind of like challenge we had is to kind of disentangle the chronology of this particular site. that might have been the central place of these foragers in this particular landscape. And so that chronology we tried with radiocarbon dating. This is one of the kind of like probably best dated sites that we have in the kind of region from that period. And what we did is the kind of Bayesian modeling of radiocarbon dates in order to kind of like get a really good grip of the chronology. And I think for certain phases of the site, we now have like pretty good like understanding of what's happening. There are some interruptions that are probably related to 8.2 event of kind of global chill that we have like around so it's like 6,200 Cal BC. Actually coinciding with the time when a lot of Neolithic communities might have moved from the Near East into Europe. Now, whether the correlation is the causation, we can discuss, but like it's quite interesting. So I'm not going to bother you with the numbers; they're just there for information. But like it's essentially we have the sort of late Mesolithic development, and then we have the kind of like transition, where we have, it seems like the transition means that basically we have the traits that are both late Mesolithic, so kind of like forager traits, and the incoming like farmers that are, and that's the phase of the trapezoid buildings. That's the phase when we have this kind of intensity of occupation, and it seems Lepenski was a hub of sort of interactions that were taking place between very different communities, the foragers, the local foragers, and the incoming farmers. So it goes back, like this is the site I excavated, late Mesolithic site. This is the background to the forager existence in the region. We have this kind of like very nice sequence of inhumations that are going over time, like over sort of almost a millennium in that location, different sort of burials that are all placed one on top of the other. And what is interesting about this particular place that we've discovered is that like it goes from the late Mesolithic, but then as we go into the later period, ornaments change on the body, and that's how we see that the Neolithic actually sort of is infiltrating into the region, and the chronology sort of supports that. Before I kind of tell you a little bit about these ornaments, this is like a more recent discovery of a burial in that area. We excavated this in 2019, but in 2020 we also kind of discovered that it contained a pig, probably a pig pet burial that is found just next to this woman. So that's pretty unique. I still need to publish it. Like we're sorting out the details of the chronology of the isotopes and everything, but like I think it's pretty unique because like in any hunter-gatherer context anywhere, I don't know of an example of a very deliberate sort of pet burial. And what we do have in Scandinavia, for example, this is a map of different sort of dog burials that are found as kind of dogs were properly buried. And in the Natufian culture of the Levant, you actually have also kind of puppy burials that are found in a couple of instances, but nothing like a pig burial, so kind of like pets. Also in Amazonia, pets are kind of like a big thing. So kind of, I think there's something quite interesting there. As for the ornaments that I mentioned, these are these pharyngeal teeth of carp, Rutilus species, that were attached to clothing. Most likely, this is our reconstruction of the kind of like burial adornments that we find in many burials. Some of these individuals had, upwards of 600, 500 beads that were sort of like found associated with the body. So what we get in one of these burials that we excavated at Vlasic is that we actually have both elements of the old and the new world. So we have the carp teeth, pharyngeal teeth as part of some kind of like headdress probably. But at the same time, we have the first arrival of something that is sort of undeniably Neolithic traits, and that's like beads made of spondylus shell. And these are like known as kind of like throughout the Neolithic as kind of really important. Also their morphology. So kind of like you see the technological way of they're made is completely different, nothing similar to what was there before. And it coincides with the period when we actually have the arrival of the first Neolithic people in the area. Similar with these beads in the same burial spot that are kind of these disc-shaped beads. Again, something that is unquestionable feature of the early Neolithic in southwestern Asia, like for example this child burial from the site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey. So kind of like you have a particular technology, material culture, ways of doing things that are clearly visible within the forager context. So this is a pretty unique situation where I think it's very rare actually to find this kind of like juxtaposition between different cultural worlds. This is further confirmed by strontium isotope analysis we did on a number of individuals, some 160 individuals, where we actually sort of document that while we have very stationary people in the Mesolithic period, so people are, it seems that like they correspond to this local range of the strontium isotope values. I mean, strontium is this kind of like isotope that you kind of enters into the body sort of and defines the place of your birth. Actually, if you analyze teeth, it stays there. It's formed during early childhood, and wherever you spent your early childhood, that's going to be the reflection of the strontium isotope. But if you moved later in life, and we could detect that if you were buried, for example, in another place, in another geological setting where the strontium signal is different. So that's the principle of the strontium isotope analysis. And so we have this kind of like very stationary people, let's say more or less during the late Mesolithic, and things change dramatically at the time when the Neolithic arrives, because we are actually having the first generation migrants who are being detected with the strontium isotopes. And in fact, teeth are very commonly found in archaeological sites. They preserve very well, and in a way they're like incredible archives of information, like especially time-resolved archives. Like I like this sort of phrase, time-resolved, because they give you the kind of chronological, very fine chronological resolution if you analyze them with the sort of dental histology. So kind of this is the work we did more recently. This is part of my research more recently, where we were actually, apart from just looking at teeth for the bulk strontium. Now I'm giving you too much technical stuff, but you can ask me later if you didn't understand something. But the bulk strontium that I mentioned before, it's just basically averaging signal of the enamel and the strontium from a particular region. So it gives you like some kind of like averaging across the life of the formation life of the tooth, of the crown. However, we now have methodologies, and this is like the cool thing, to analyze, to kind of like provide the chronology of the enamel growth, and then to analyze strontium along that enamel growth chronology, and to provide like kind of very high resolution at the level of months and years of the changes that might have taken place with particular sort of movement of particular individuals in their early life years, i.e. during those years when the crown, when the enamel forms. And so kind of different teeth, this is like just a summary of that, different teeth form at different times, and like we could, ideally cover maybe like the first 15, 16, 17 years of life if we look at different teeth, even though they individually cover shorter periods of life. So what we discovered there, and that's quite interesting, is that for certain individuals that looked with the bulk strontium, with the averaging of the strontium signal, they looked foreign. What we discovered is that these foreign individuals in their early life actually have this kind of incredibly differentiated pattern of probably seasonal movement. So they're coming from different communities where seasonality of mobility was very emphasized. Whereas the individuals who were born in that particular area were very stationary. So there you don't find that. So kind of the local signal is like almost like a flat line. With the foreign signal, people coming from elsewhere, we see this kind of seasonal movement from one geology to another during early life of these individuals, and they look foreign and they came from somewhere else into these forager communities. So it's a very interesting way of actually kind of tracking mobility by means of individual mobility, not just population mobility as with ancient DNA. So another way of studying that is cementochronology. studying seasonality. So far we did analysis and continue to do some work on this, but did the analysis on red deer, which is red deer is a species that was very frequently hunted in those sites, and we kind of like analyzed red deer teeth for information about seasonality and cementum analysis of these teeth. And instead of just looking at the, traditionally, I don't have that much time to go into the details again, but like traditionally, cementotechnology was done by looking at the outer layer of the cementum. You would say, is it translucent or it's opaque? So meaning, is it like a winter season or it's like a summer season? Because like there are physiological changes in the cementum and they can be used for counting years of life of an individual. So kind of like providing the calculation of the age. Now we're did something where we actually sort of looked at the elements found in the cementum, kind of chemical analysis of the elements, and we were able to predict with higher degree of certainty the season of death of these individuals, and by proxy of like knowing the season of death of these red deer individuals, we know when people were at the site, at what time of the year. And in this case, whatever we analyzed, it seemed like the sign is the winter. So at least like winter is the season when people were hunting red deer, whereas like if they are sedentary and stationary along the Danube in these sites, summer might have been the season when fish was predominantly caught and so on. So kind of like working towards kind of the understanding of the movement, mobility, sedentism of these different populations. And that all is like accompanied like, and Mercedes like sort of warned me that I need to talk about ancient DNA more. But like, so kind of we collaborate with, I think you Mercedes as well, we collaborate with a lab of David Reich at Harvard Medical School, but with some other people as well. And so kind of like we analyzed a large number of individuals from this area by now. Some of this is published, some remains to be published. Some of this work was done through the project that I mentioned at the beginning. One of the alternative ways of finding human remains that we can analyze for ancient DNA is by doing this that is called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. It's basically kind of trying from small fragments of bone, trying to understand whether, like somewhere where there are no diagnostic elements to actually identify human or different species of animal, you can, on the basis of peptide fingerprinting, we were able to actually kind of get like the signal for humans, and then if we find humans in the faunal assemblages, analyze those humans for ancient DNA. So, but it can be also useful for zooarchaeology. It's something where you could, like in the highly fragmented assemblages, you can have a better idea of what is the faunal species composition in those assemblages. So this is what we also did within the project, and it was like there was some good success with that. So we continue to kind of, these are just various papers, but like, I can skip that slide. The one important paper that was published in 2018 is the first one where we actually kind of like had the data from some of these sites that I mentioned from the region. And so in many of these are actually hunter-gatherers. So kind of like they have 100% sort of hunter-gatherer ancestry in their like sort of, and in fact, after this study, this particular group of burials, because there are so many individuals, they became their own cluster, like of like sort of the early Holocene sort of hunter-gatherers in this region. Otherwise, they are known as Western Eurasian hunter-gatherers across Europe with different sort of clans. But apart from that, what was very interesting at the site of Lepenski and another site nearby, we discovered the admixtures between the kind of like, so what we already saw in the archaeological record, and it was also kind of like seen to some extent through strontium isotopes, we now integrated with the ancient DNA data that show that certain individuals, as this kind of particular boy buried in one of these trapezoidal buildings that had like, 50-50 sort of ancestry, or more or less like that, between the kind of hunter-gatherers and the first farmers. So kind of two very distinct ancestries that genetically can be modeled and kind of like can be sort of seen as distinct in the signature. There were other individuals that were very interestingly buried according to the forager burial rite of extended inhumations, whereas like typical for Neolithic across the Near East is crouched burials, so kind of flexed or crouched burials, sometimes maybe tied like or kind of like wrapped. This is the 100% sort of Neolithic ancestry coming from northwest Anatolia, and yet it was buried during this particular phase at the site of Lepenski Vir as an extended inhumation. And many of these individuals were actually women, but it's not only women. We do have like sort of, I mean, so it's not like only sort of the exchange of women as traditionally, thought like of kind of coming into another community. There were some males that were coming in this forager community, and sort of it seems like that at that time, at least for a period of time, that forager community was the dominant force, whereas like the Neolithic groups kind of like just infiltrated and started kind of like changing things. And that's what's seen then with the arrival of the new material culture and so on, and possibly also by their presence in these settlements, there was the sort of, let's say, the learning or kind of the transmission of their technological skills and ideas to the local population that eventually changed things in this area. These are other examples of that. We also have like sort of, it seems like the introduction of certain other elements of the Neolithic world, such as Bucrania, or kind of this kind of large aurochs skull, wild cattle, that are very prominent features of the symbolism of the Neolithic in the Near East. Again, sort of appearing here, kind of placed above the head of the deceased in this burial, kind of like, again, during this particular phase. So I might skip a little bit here, just so that we don't stay here for too long. But I mean, I just wanted to say something about bioarchaeology, agricultural transition. So we have this kind of like myth between, what was the kind of like affluent sort of forager society, hunter-gatherer society versus a Neolithic society, where we think that there is a deterioration of the conditions of sort of living in those early villages from like mobile hunter-gatherers and so on. Even though with the foragers we saw, they might have already lived in pretty stationary sort of communities. That it seems that there was like a growth, agricultural growth in terms of the population because of the fertility, of the perhaps like sort of being tied to a particular place. But again, in the early Neolithic of the region, we see there is a lot of complexity. People are moving a lot. So kind of like a bit kind of counterintuitively, we do have like people moving in the early Neolithic and they're very stationary in the Mesolithic. So it's kind of like, it's not black and white picture. And there's the Neolithic demographic transition model that sort of postulates all these different traits. For example, sedentariness, food rich in carbohydrates, reduced maternal sort of energetics, leading to population growth, which then leads to unsanitary living conditions and high pathogen load in some of the villages, and kind of leads also to higher infant and subadult mortality. And sort of also the kind of osteological paradox that you, with a kind of like higher number of pathologies, you might be expecting actually higher survival rates because they are sort of like present in the archaeological record. So in this particular area, it seems like exactly at the time of the transition, this is like calculating juvenility index. We have a very high peak of sort of in the, actually it's here, yeah, the black line here. A very high peak of the neonate burials being there, which would be again expected if you, and kind of children below the age of 5, if you are having this kind of like situation with the kind of like more pathogens, living conditions in larger villages, and so on. Finally, just to mention that diet in these kind of communities seems to also change over time. This is like a complex diagram with like stable isotopes from carbon and nitrogen that shows different phases of occupation. But what is very interesting is that there is like, for example, thinking of the proximity of this population to the water, to the fishing, and so on, and to getting the protein. there is the sort of like those people who are in their isotope values are eating more fish. They are at the same time have this external auditory exostosis, so kind of the growth of the ear bone, which basically it comes from the exposure to cold water. So kind of like there's that kind of interesting correlation. But what happens essentially is that we have this kind of like our diagram is populated in this kind of upper left corner of the diagram, which means that these people are eating a lot of aquatic food, so kind of 70-80% of the aquatic food, and this is not a marine signal. Marine signal, you would have this quadrant here populated with like very high carbon isotope values, and then these black dots here are actually the dots that are indicating the agricultural, kind of more terrestrial diets, so kind of the period of the Neolithic. People are still eating a lot of fish, but they're individuals that are kind of at the lower spectrum of this. So kind of again, that correlates with other things about the arrival of the Neolithic and kind of the movement of different individuals that are actually lived in communities where fish was not the dominant sort of food. And finally, this is confirmed by lipid residue analysis, where different from most of the other areas in Europe of the early Neolithic, where we see a kind of major contribution of the lipids from ruminants, so kind of terrestrial animals. In this region, 50%, and with the biomarkers indicating fish, 50% of the lipids come from the consumption of fish. So preparation and then probably consumption of fish. And only in Scandinavia you have like something similar, but not as much sort of fish present in the diet, even of the early Neolithic inhabitants of the region. So kind of like when the pottery becomes dominant. So all of that is, you can find in this book, shameless sort of promotion here. But like, you know, it's kind of like, it's already old, so I need to publish something new. But like, it's kind of like something that that gives you the kind of like summary of various sort of aspects that I talked about. And then finally, I'm just very briefly, I think I might have like a couple of minutes to go through the work that I did in the Eastern Adriatic region. So Eastern Adriatic region, there are different dynamics, and so kind of like looking at the kind of like wider, I think it's important to look at the wider picture there and kind of different dynamics of the Neolithization process. There we have like a later arrival, it seems like, of the Neolithic in the region. They seem to be moving along this kind of Adriatic coast between sort of Italy and Croatian coast, Dalmatian coast. Movement from southeast to the northwest, occupying many sites that are close to the coast, for probably maritime sort of movement of people with boats and occupying different open air sites and primarily caves, though, where we have like a lot of repositories actually found in the caves. And pottery and domesticates are moving with migrating farmers as possibly status symbols. So, but like we kind of studied some of this, and kind of it seems like there is again like a blurred picture between what are the identities of first foragers and the last farmers. There are certain sites where we can study this. For example, at this particular site called Odmut in Montenegro, we have these barbed points or harpoons, if you want, that we dated, and some of them date to the late Mesolithic, but then some examples also continue into the early Neolithic when already pottery and some domesticates arrived to the region. So it seems like things don't change very much there. The transition is a bit later than in the Danube Gorges area. It's like around 6000 BC. We continued these kind of investigations also at one particular site where we did the excavation. This is like called Vrbička cave in the Dinaric Alps of Montenegro. And here found Mesolithic deposits with some of the interesting features. Remember those carp like pharyngeal teeth that I mentioned in the Danube Gorges? Sure enough, we find two examples. This is like 400 kilometers apart from the Danube Gorges area, where we find them in hundreds. Here we have found a couple of them, which seems like to be indication of the contact between these different forager communities. But interestingly, we also found this tooth Western Eurasian hunter-gatherer ancestry, so it's typical for the Balkans at that time. Again, these populations, these are probably small populations, but populations that are also interacting with each other in terms of kind of genetic pool that we have there. And then found also kind of like early Neolithic traits with this particular canine coming from Northwest Anatolian ancestry and dated at the time around 5,900, 5,800 Cal BC, where these kind of early Neolithic communities are coming in the region. And my final slide is the kind of like work we recently started to do in one cave on the island of Hvar in Croatia. Very nice island, warmly recommended for a visit. You see my sort of trend of moving from the hinterland into the kind of closer to the coast. You know, I think it's normal. It comes with age. But anyway, here we find a really interesting example of like a layer so far. Hopefully something older as well. But like we find a Mesolithic layer full of the remains of hair. So kind of like people are, and this is typical of the sort of late Pleistocene, early Holocene in the Mediterranean, sites with huge amount of like hair remains, kind of like, like hair, like lepus, and so these guys, and so also Columbella rustica beads. So these are like very typical for the Mesolithic, also late Paleolithic in Europe. These kind of beads, the kind of gastropods that were collected and turned into beads. And so kind of midden deposits of that stuff. I don't want to say like stambakis, but like, you know, middens. Like, and then we also have the early Neolithic arriving to around the same time, 6,000, like in Montenegro, to the region. So we continue to work. I mean, I don't have that much to report there, but like we continue to work on this stuff because like it's very interesting to kind of see what are the dynamics of this transition, especially because these late Mesolithic deposits are very close to the early Neolithic, and so kind of trying to understand how that transition in this area where we don't have that much information like in the previous region that I talked about, the Danube Gorges, how that transition actually took place. So, okay, I'm just going to say a couple of things about multi-stage colonization. This is the final slide. So we have Neolithic pioneers, probably in the initial phase, coming into the region, targeted exploration with forager-farmer admixtures taking place in certain places where foragers are very present, like the area of the Danube Gorges area, adoption of certain Neolithic elements. We have riparian corridors that are used, like the Danube River, as a kind of marked, like kind of landscape where people are kind of like, and this was probably even more than humans, like again going back to 40 or 50,000 years ago. We see that like that Danube corridor might have been very important. And then there is like something that would be seen as a later phase of the development across the region, that you could call a settler residential phase, when there is a reduced mobility, more typical Neolithic sort of assemblages, and the infilling of these different parts of the region with a full reliance on agriculture and the almost complete disappearance of forager identities in any of these locations. Okay, I think I'm just going to finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry for going a little bit over time.
No,
like, yeah.
I think, I mean, yeah. Eu já tô. Ah, no microfone porque está sendo filmado, entendi, claro. You want a mic? Ou não? Você fala, eu te ajudo. Tá bom, beleza.
Falar.
Tá bom, obrigado.
Eu queria entender melhor. Ele falou que tem uma comparação às crianças que morrem, né, de mortalidade infantil. Então, eu não sei se eu entendi direito. Morre mais na época dos farmers, então você aumenta, aumenta a comida, mas tem mais parasitas, é isso? E aí morre mais crianças?
I understand.
You got it?
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. So basically the foragers that we see where we have the increase of the infant mortality. So the foragers that we see there seem to be behaving like in between foragers and farmers. So they're already occupying villages that are pretty large, where the pathogens might have been really kind of like going around and influencing this kind of higher mortality. They're also in that phase where we have this kind of like large number of infants being buried. They're actually buried underneath the building floors. There are like around 40 infant burials, neonate burials. And they seem to be, now we have some new data, but like it's not published, but like they seem to be a mixture between the hunter-gatherers and farmers. So kind of like you have essentially already this site being slowly transformed into a Neolithic village, even though it's kind of like foragers that are present very substantially in the village. Did this the kind of clarify? Because maybe that was not clear. This is the expectation that the mortality will be high in Neolithic villages, right? Because foragers are moving a lot, they're like, but in this case, we have something of a hybrid situation where we have like sort of foragers and farmers interacting, mixing, and also it seems that the site is bigger than the typical hunter-gatherer site. So kind of it almost approximates a Neolithic village. Sure.
And I have one other one.
Tá bom?
Yes.
Do you think that the climate change in that time could improve the the population to go to up in Europe, or
to kind of move further?
Yes, if some paleoclimate climate change influence somehow the movements.
So traditionally, like climate change is, archaeology, all archaeologists know it's like sort of this kind of thing. Some people love climate change, some, because it's like an easy explanation, right? Like,
Okay.
yeah. So, you see, climate change, something changed in the human culture, right? Like that's the kind of I wouldn't dismiss climate as kind of an important sort of influence on what happens with humans. Never, because like I think, especially in earlier periods when we were talking about, last glacial maximum, or we were talking about like these big changes that are happening. But even in Holocene, like maybe there were events when we have like, and it would certainly influence human society. What I don't believe is that like, that's the solution to everything, that's the explanation to everything. I think it's like an important thing to consider, and there are certain things to consider, but I wouldn't say that like early Holocene people who are already very sophisticated, even Upper Paleolithic people are very sophisticated in their possible response to climatic change. They can adopt, they can adjust, they have means, they have agency and means of being capable of surviving in this, whatever is the, but yes, maybe there is a push factor. There is like a, some people claim that in a certain period of this climate event, 8.2, the productivity of the river Danube was different. So people might have like been saying, okay, we need to adjust our strategies of kind of like subsistence or kind of how we deal with this climatic change. But whether that influenced people moving into Europe, I don't know. I wouldn't say that climate was the main mover of the kind of like push for people to move. I think it's like maybe social factors. So kind of like people living in agricultural villages in the Near East and certain populations being, kind of pushed out, or kind of like deciding to kind of leave the hierarchies of like the sort of that were being created in certain villages, and this way explore new territories and move further into new lands. And we don't know, but like but obviously there is like kind of like a sort of this push sort of from the Near East into maybe you could think also of the conditions of the environments that they were living. The Neolithic is very aggressive to the environment, in the sense of like you're cutting trees, you're kind of burning forests, you're creating the conditions of the deforestation and kind of like the carrying capacity of a particular region might not be able to carry that amount of people and so on. So you might need to expand in order to sustain that type of existence.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know whether the Amazonia can be considered in a similar sense that people are, but there was never that kind of like, there's too much land, like maybe, I don't know. Yeah, 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 yeah.
By the way, by the chance, have you found some changes at the ashes of the fogueiras? Esqueci.
The hearts, yeah.
Yes, when
Fireplaces.
Neolithicus or Paleolithicus, or through the time, do you think the ashes, those fogueiras, are much more amount or a little amount? Have you seen different layers? Something?
With the hearts changing over time, like is
Yeah,
that?
like suppose farmers use it much more fogueiras, so
Yeah.
we found much more layers,
Yeah.
and that's somehow we can say, observing the layers, we say the type of which how population are farmers or foragers,
Uh-huh.
or
No, not in that sense. I mean, some of these buildings that I mentioned with these rectangular stone hearts, they have like ash there, but like, I mean, they were probably processing fish there, like and kind of like using them for drying fish, or kind of like just kind of like as a central location, probably mixed with sacral roles, because they're like boulders, you know, these sculpted things and so on that are sometimes placed around these hearts and so on. But what we kind of like along the kind of the idea of your question, what we do have is the evidence from geoarchaeology, so kind of like from micromorphological analysis and so on, that in many of these locations, so these locations are found on the hills that are sloping towards the river and kind of river terraces, right? And so kind of like we had like forests blanketing that in the early Holocene. So people are coming there, and they're starting to do their thing. And then what micromorphology seems to show, that after a while, living in that place starts to exhaust the forest, which is reflected in the landslide. So kind of like in the processes of erosion from the hill, so kind of happening in the Mesolithic, but also in the Neolithic, it seems, maybe even more pronounced in the Neolithic because of the greater demand for wood. So kind of people are cutting forests. They're not aware that when they're cutting these trees, like many today around the world, they're not aware. When you're cutting the trees, you're basically, you're starting the erosional processes that are eventually kind of gonna, you know, especially like if you're cutting the trees that is the closest to you, which is uphill, you're starting the erosive processes that are going to eventually cover your living area, you know, kind of like that through. So kind of, I think we have evidence of that, like people are kind of exploiting that environment, and maybe the abandonment of certain locations or sites and so on is caused by these kinds of sort of erosional events.
Okay, understand.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a doubt regarding the deer teeth. So you said that we can estimate what season the deer died depending on whether a certain material in the teeth was translucent or opaque.
Yeah.
Could you please elaborate more on
Yeah.
that? I didn't
Okay.
understand.
So this is like something that has been observed for a very long time. That like all animals, including humans, like we have this kind of like alternate sort of biannual kind of changes in the cementum. So kind of, and that basically gives you also the count. You can use it with maybe more precision than like the classical physical anthropology methods for adults to sort of get like at the age or at death of the individuals, because you're just basically counting the lines, and the pair of like translucent and opaque is 1 year, right? And you go and then you count the years depending on when the tooth erupted, depending on what tooth you're looking at, right? And so, so this was the classic way. But like there was always this issue and the problem of the preparation of sections that you can count these lines, but like, you know, people were trying, at least in the 1990s, that was like a big thing, to kind of like see what is the outer layer, and on the basis of that to say, well, the season at death is either summer or winter, or like some people were very optimistic, so they were saying even like, you know, early summer or, you know, like that kind of stuff. In my experience, I found this, and I think many people share this kind of view, that it's very unreliable way of like, there's a lot of guesswork, because it's not sort of, the way you check this is you have several observers who are like looking at the same section independently, and then you make a count later, and you know, sometimes like it's completely off, like, you know, the results are all over the place. And so we came up with one colleague in particular called Paola Cerito. We came up with this kind of idea that like sort of, let's look at the elements of the cementum. So kind of like doing the SEM, so scanning electron microscopy, then kind of like doing the EDS kind of like tracks on the cementum, and kind of counting different elements like calcium, zinc, oxygen, and so on. And then kind of like trying to see whether there are seasonal changes in these elements of the cement. And our study shows that there are some papers published on something else. This right there, they are still not published. So we're hoping like we're going to have them this year publish the article on that, and kind of showing, so we did it on a comparative sample of red deer where we know the season of death of these individuals. And on the basis of death, or on the basis of that sample, we actually kind of managed to apply the same methodology to archaeological specimens and to kind of like understand better what might have been the season of death of these red deer individuals. And we did red deer, but you can do it in other animals as well, and potentially doing it with humans. That would be very interesting, you know, kind of like to also kind of determine the season, you know, at least kind of like saying this biannual season, or, you know, 3 seasons, kind of trying to understand what is the season of death. I mean, it has applicability also in forensic studies, because that's the kind of like place where you might want to know. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's amazing the amount of data that you have.
Yeah.
Very, you know, refined data. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I think, I mean, these questions that, you know, the way you open your talk, talking about this, like these broad models about, you know, Neolithic change, like, you know, demic diffusion and things like that. I mean, they normally like they take up a very broad scale. And I think what you really have here, and one of the advantages of working in places with larger visibility, as you mentioned in the beginning, is that you can really get, you know, a very good detailed picture of what happened in those places. And would you agree if I say that what you're seeing there, like it's demic diffusion happened locally, maybe like, you know, at a generations scale, instead of like just putting the map of Europe and having the broad dates. So would you say that, broadly speaking, demic diffusion still holds well as a model to explain what happened there at that scale, or you see something else which is afforded by the resolution of the data that you have?
I think, like, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to, like, I think you're right. Like, whatever scale you're looking at, you're going to see slightly different things, I think. Like, so if you're interested in very big movements, you know, you discard all this detailed stuff, you see maybe the movement that is like demic diffusion. But the moment you get into the details, because the devil is in the details, right? Sort of, you start getting these kind of very divergent, kind of different sort of stories of like kind of strange things maybe happening, you know, kind of like one individual coming like from a crazy far area, like, you know, like these micro histories, almost like events. And I think, you know, that's important. Maybe it's important to keep both scales in mind. I think demic diffusion is a kind of very, covers it all, like, right, model, like, generally it's true, maybe. Yeah. Generally.
Genetic data seems to say that.
Yeah.
That's what happened, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. But at the same time, it seems like there are a lot of interesting processes happening. So I think like it's also like, what are you interested in? Like, are you interested in kind of telling this big story? I think like I'm personally more interested in all this detail, because I think there's like a lot of complexity that sort of gets like covered up by a big story of the demic diffusion. Like there every now and then there's this modeling of the dates or like genetic data and so on. Oh, there is the trend of people moving. Personally, I find that like a little bit uninteresting, because like I think there's much more that we can unpack in all this kind of data, and that's my personal preference, I would say that maybe it's true that we have this kind of moving front, but we at the same time it seems to have these infiltrations into parts of the region. And then something that I didn't mention is that like, how do you deal with the situations that we'll soon have publications of that? Again, like this is unpublished stuff, but like we have situations that like early Neolithic ancestry becomes the dominant ancestry in Southeastern Europe and across Europe, right? But then 1,000 years later, we have the resurgence of the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry of the same that kind of disappeared, that seemingly disappeared. And now we have cemeteries that were discovered, like, and they analyzed the ancient DNA data, where we have like sort of islands of hunter-gatherers completely independently from early Neolithic sites, surviving for a very long time, and only maybe 1,000 years after the first arrival of the Neolithic, starting to interchange, and then we see them as a kind of like mixing with the. So kind of like there are crazy sort of histories that are, and they're not very visible, again, because pottery and Neolithic sites, they're much more visible than any hunter-gatherer site would be. So kind of like, you also have this kind of idea of like early Neolithic being more complex, and kind of complexity is visible, whereas like these people who are hunter-gatherers and kind of maybe simplistic, in their cultural or social organization or whatever, they choose to be simplistic in the sense that like they don't want to be part of this kind of Neolithic world, They become then, on their own terms, they become part of that world, and that's where genetic analysis are so cool, because like you see that these kind of almost archaeologically invisible processes taking place. So I don't know, it's a very long answer, but like it's kind of like, I think there are a lot of interesting things and that can be discovered that are, to me, more interesting than just saying, is it demic diffusion or it's, I don't know, what else. But what we do see is that when these people, Neolithic is very pervasive, like, I guess, is that, so it kind of like, once it comes, it's sort of like people are taken by it, like apart from these islands of hunter-gatherers that eventually also become kind of Neolithic. But they have some kind of like at first, maybe there are certain areas, in this area we see the forager-farmer interactions, but there might have been areas where people were for a very long time avoiding any contact and interaction. So again, like, I'm thinking also of the kind of more recent history of the indigenous people across South America, right? Like kind of like in certain places you would have like exchange and contact, in other places you would have like kind of long periods of like sort of resistance or kind of like avoidance and so on. So there are very many multiple histories that are taking place. But if you look at the Neolithic as something inevitably happening, and then you can talk about the demic diffusion as a kind of like this wave that covers it. It happens, yeah. But like, how important is that to what's actually happening on the ground? Yeah. We see it as a kind of retrospective history, right? Like, so kind of, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the talk. When you sent me the title, Bioarchaeology of Forager-Farmer Transition in Southeastern Europe, I thought, well, that's pretty bold and ambitious, but you know it. So, and I guess we all learn how you can approach a very complex problem using different methodologies. Really, really nice. My question is more about what can you tell us based on, I don't know, burial patterns or diet patterns about the origins of social status or social inequality in these populations?
In these populations, yeah. I mean, I don't think that we see the kind of any social inequality, like in the sense of like, you know, the rise of inequality or anything like that at this time. And in fact, even throughout the Neolithic, like in the region, I think there is like the maintenance of, even though they're like big sites, you know, developed Neolithic like becomes like something like with huge villages, like sometimes like 50 to maybe even 100 hectares large, enclosed and so on. But I think that they maintain for a very long time these kind of like leveling mechanisms. So my theory is that it's like there's like, but this is because I love the sort of South American kind of Amazonian ethnography, that it's violence, you know, that was like very interesting there, and so kind of like warfare and so on. But you know, there are many enclosed villages. I think there is like dynamic like of interaction between these different villages, and it's a huge topic for throughout the Neolithic. Like I think there are big ditches, enclosures, and so on. But within the settlement, there are no kind of like architectural units, let's say, or kind of like accumulation of wealth within those sort of contexts. The first time you see something that could be that, but maybe it's just seemingly that, but maybe not, is for example, there is the cemetery of Varna, where you have this kind of golden objects in a large amount found. This is the beginning of the Copper Age on the Black Sea coast on the Bulgarian coast, and close to the Danube, to the delta of the Danube. And there you see this kind of like ostentatious kind of sort of display of copper, gold, you know, all of these things that kind of very often is used as a kind of the image of the kind of like the rise of social complexity and the kind of like the rise of this kind of like, and it's possibly that there's definitely, you know, there's no denying that gold might have like been perceived in this way very early on with the rise of metallurgy. Kind of like we might have in the Balkans some of the earliest example of copper smelting and metallurgy taking place. There are kind of rich ore mines, especially in eastern parts of the region, and so but you know, it's again debatable to what extent that's there are no early states, and this is like a big thing. Like you know, different from the Near East, where you know there is this path leading to the beginnings of the early states and so on. It seems that any attempt at kind of like aggrandizing, like of like kind of creating this kind of like large villages and so on, kind of fails. That eventually these kind of like villages collapse, and they you know, some people call it tribal cycling. So kind of there's this kind of movement of from like kind of you become very important, but then there's like kind of like the decline of the, so that nothing leads to the permanent office of sort of inheritance or like of sort of inherited social status through birth. That kind of like would be the feature of archaic states and what's happening there. And you know, they were quoting example in Ukraine, for example, like right there are these mega sites, that the Tripoli culture, where you have this kind of like huge agglomerations and so on. And yet you don't see in the layout of buildings and so on, you don't see the kind of central office. Kind of, there's no kind of complex of buildings, for example, that would be kind of a clear indication of a ruling elite or anything like that.
Even religion, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So you know, to what extent, you know, this is something that was discussed in the book that we were talking about, like the dawn of everything, right? Like it's kind of this idea that even these big sites were somehow self-managed without the kind of central authority being present in those villages. So I think that's very interesting. Like how and why that happened, and why. I mean, it's a huge question, like why this kind of like rise of complexity and early states appear in Mesopotamia, in the kind of urban centers in Southwestern Asia. So I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. The hunter-gatherers that you say that stays like a village, and could you say that they are settled down?
I think that, you know, on the basis of some of this analysis we did, like for example, this kind of enamel sort of strontium isotopes and so on, I think also on the basis of the permanence of some of these structures, the investment in the place by kind of building there, burying people there, like, you know, it seems that these sites might have been like sedentary. Maybe they're not like kind of like complete year-round Neolithic villages, but they seem to have this permanence that is quite important to them. And it's like, it's, it could be comparable to something you find in other parts of the world where you have this kind of like very high levels of, how do you call it, like rich, biologically rich sort of kind of like in resources systems. For example, northwest coast in America is like where you see this kind of very complex, you know, that's where the complex, that's where the idea of the complex hunter-gatherers comes, that you have this kind of like hunter-gatherers that are by, you know, their subsistence hunter-gatherers, but with a lot of complexity that reminds you of the kind of later kind of like types of societies that are maybe agricultural and so on, with a kind of complex cultural and social arrangements, with the investment and the commitment to place and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to thank you again for coming. I hope it will not take us another 15 years to meet again in person. Also thank Eduardo Neves from the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology for helping me organizing this talk. Thank you for the YouTube audience, and shall we give another round of applause?
Thanks.